gang intervention, gang prevention is a social justice issue. It cannot be done in isolation. I've done it in isolation, and it just can't work. You can save lives, you can help kids. I've helped hundreds and hundreds of kids in Chicago and LA and other cities, but you really can't get rid of the root of it unless you address the issues that are social, economic, and political in those communities. Unless you address the very reasons why sometimes we have homeless people or people on drugs or just at-risk youth, regardless if they're in gangs or not. They all have the same root. And you know what that is. What is the root of that? Poverty is probably the number one thing. I would like for us to think about a dialogue and maybe questions and a little back and forth here. So what I'm gonna do is just say a few things about the work that I do. Some people might know from Always Running. I don't know if people had a chance to even look at the book, but it's used a lot in a lot of schools. And it's around the country. I've been going actually more recently to New York City because the book has been used in the schools there, and I hardly ever go there. So when I started going, they've invited me now 6 times to speak to kids, speak to teachers, speak to people working with gang. In fact, I'm coming back in mid-May, and I'm going back in June. So it's all over the country because of the fact that gangs have spread out. When I was in a gang 45 years ago, whenever it was, the gangs wasn't for everybody. Not everybody was going to join the gang. We didn't even want everybody. People say you recruit people. We didn't recruit nobody. We didn't want nobody in the gang unless they really wanted to be in a gang. You know what I'm saying? Because basically you had to be a certain kind of person. Very few people could be that. And it became very close-knit. You knew everybody. You knew who was in the gang. You trusted them. Now they have these super gangs where you don't even know half the people, not even half, most of the people in the gang. You don't even know them because they're super gangs in the sense that they're all over the country. I worked with all of them since then. When I left the gang life, I was a violent young man. I was on heroin for 7 years. I left everything and then started working with gangs, helping kids get out of gangs. I've been doing that for almost 45 years. I started with the Chicano gangs in the 1970s. I was part of the End Body Warfare Coalition. I was part of the Body Federation. I was part of a number of peace efforts then. I also moved to Chicago in 1980 and started working with youth and gangs there. For 15 years. I spent many years there working with the Chicago gangs. I still have ties with them. I kind of know why things have gotten so bad there versus other cities, and we can talk about that. I also went back to LA when the Bloods and Crips were doing their unity meetings and rallies, just before and after the LA uprising, which, as you know, was considered a gang uprising. The worst civil disturbance in the country in more than 100 years. And so I went back there to work with kids, and I have some of that experience. And then also, as mentioned earlier, I've done some work in Mexico, but also El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, as well as Argentina and Venezuela and Peru, working with street kids, working with gang kids. I was fortunate to even go to England and work with Afro-Caribbean community there, and also Italy, working with juvenile offenders. And so we can share a number of things about all this. I think there's a thread running through everybody that's in a gang, regardless of what country, and there's also some unique things about each one of them. So the one thing I want to share is that I do prison writing workshops every Monday in 2 maximum security yards in a California prison. And this past Monday, I graduated 4 classes because we had to do them all, 4 different ones, because we couldn't graduate my other classes earlier. So we had a really great number of guys. Again, this is general population, especially what we call the B yard. This is a high level of violent. There was 3 weeks in which there was a lockdown because 3 people got stabbed there. It's a rough place, but I will tell you, the young men in my class, and they're not just young men, older men, some guys are lifers, some guys are never gonna get out of prison, are some of the best people you ever wanna meet. They really are amazing people. I love working with them. They are really into the writing, telling their story, being as decent as they can be, knowing that some of them have done some terrible things. And I tell my wife that when I had this last class, there was about 30 guys in there, and my wife's never been in gangs. She don't know. She never been through this, you know. I said, you would have died watching these guys. They're all buffed. They're all tattooed. The Chicano guys got tattoos all over their faces. They all look hard, but I told them, once we get them talking, once we get them writing, once we get them open up, they're some of the sweetest guys you ever want to meet. She doesn't really believe me, but it's just true. It's just, you got to cut through that exterior, but once you do, you find some really great human beings. I think to me that's what's important, because to me, gang intervention, gang prevention is a social justice issue. It cannot be done in isolation. I've done it in isolation, and it just can't work. You can save lives, you can help kids. I've helped hundreds and hundreds of kids in Chicago and LA and other cities, but you really can't get rid of the root of it unless you address the issues that are social, economic, and political in those communities. Unless you address the very reasons why sometimes we have homeless people or people on drugs or just at-risk youth, regardless if they're in gangs or not. They all have the same root, and you know what that is. What is the root of that? Poverty is probably the number one thing. And these are not poverty because people chose to be poor, which I always get from people. This is poverty that has been planned, designed, and allowed to continue. And so I will give you some background of what I mean, because both LA and Chicago are industrial cities. I know people don't think of LA that way. Chicago, everybody knows about the steel mills and the stockyards and everything, but LA actually has more manufacturing than any other city in the country. And I'm not talking about Hollywood. That's an industry, but that's a whole separate industry. I'm talking about meat packing, steel mills, auto plants. It had everything. I worked in those plants. In order for me not to go back to heroin and jail and everything, I had to work. And so I did many years of working in a steel mill. I worked in a lead foundry. I worked in chemical refineries, paper mills. I learned welding, pipe fitting, mechanics, carpentry. I learned all these skills. And then in the 80s, if some of you might recall, happened in Massachusetts, it happened all over the country. Jobs were taken away. Industry was gone. And in LA alone, by 1984, 300 factories, plants, and mills were shuttered, and many hundreds more since then. Chicago, as you know, the Rust Belt, Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland, you can go on down the line. They called it the Rust Belt because all these places were left hanging. But guess who paid the price? The poor working class, mostly black and brown inner city people, but also white people in even rural areas who could no longer find a job. People don't talk about this anymore. But you have to talk about deindustrialization in the United States. It was a massive shift in production. We went from the industrial might of the world to almost all gone. And there's two basic reasons for it. One is the technology change. As you know, we're in the digital age. There's no way around it. Digital technology changed the way you produce things, just like the way we live, the way we do things. It changed everything. The other thing was those jobs up to that point was getting to be pretty good. And anybody who worked in a steel mill or a nice factory or plant or anything, no? Okay. You had union wages. You had pensions. You had benefits. When I worked at the Bethlehem steel plant, they covered, my wife had we had two babies together, my first wife. One of them was through Bethlehem steel plant. It only cost me $4 for that baby to be born because she wanted a TV. That was the extra, That's gone. That's all gone. All the little strivings for middle class that primarily poor blacks, Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, white people were trying to do, gone. You understand? In LA, it impacted because South Central and East LA, which is considered the two gang capitals of the world, those jobs didn't exist for their parents, let alone for those kids. I'm working on a TV show called Snowfall. Anybody get a chance to see it? FX TV? I'm a script consultant. You know what's it about, right? How crack came into the ghettos and barrios of Los Angeles, and of course from there, every major inner city in the country. So here you have industry leaving, And then you have crack coming in. During the period of the second war on drugs, the Reagan administration, huge amount of money to stop war on drugs, and more drugs came in that didn't even exist before. And the story does try to tell in a very highly dramatized way. It's not as truthful as I wish it was, but you know how it is at TV. But it does try to tell the story of the CIA's participation, the people in the communities, both in the Black community and the Mexican community, caught up in it. And I'm hoping that if the third season comes up, they will talk about how we stopped the crack epidemic, because nobody tells that story. You know that there's no longer a crack epidemic. Now we got opioids, right? I mean, it goes from one thing to the other, but still, there was an effort and people stopped the crack. And a lot of more crackheads that said, I'm done. A lot of more community leaders and organizers that went out there in the streets. I know, I witnessed it. Nobody tells their story. People with no money, no resources helped stop the destruction of crack. I'm not saying crack ain't out there. I'm just saying it's not what it used to be. And we can stop opioids too, but they won't let us. What do I mean by that? I mean that all of us who have been doing gang intervention for as long as I have, and I've seen it up, and I've been going to prisons for 38 years, so I know when prisons were so closed down, so hard to be into, to now the shift, kind of what's happening now is they're letting programming come in, they're letting resources, they're letting people like me do creative writing again. I've seen all the shifts. And I will tell you honestly, we could stop gang violence, and I think we can even stop drug addiction in this country. But there's no political will. There's no resources. There's no reason for it because it's a big industry. Do you understand what I'm saying? Not just the drug industry, which is big money, but the industry to try to stop it is big. I'll give you an example of what I mean. Let's go to one of the worst places in the world that you can even, if you can imagine this place, it's worse than you think you can imagine, El Salvador. And I was there for 25 years. And I was there when the Mara Salvatrucha, by the way, the Mara Salvatrucha is not from El Salvador. They're from LA. Of Salvadorian refugees that came up because of wars that we supported, by the way. They came up to LA and began to organize themselves, because that's what you got to do in LA. You got Bloods and Crips, you got the Sureño gangs, all the Chicano gangs, you have to organize yourself like anybody else. And after the '92 uprising, cynically, the government did two things. Went after the Bloods and Crips, they broke up all the police, peace, unity, all this stuff. They went after them, mass incarceration, 13, the film, the whole thing about slavery within the prison walls. But also they went after all the Mexican and Central American gang members. They deported them from LA streets. El Salvador, and I know because I was there in the 80s, I was in Honduras, Nicaragua, El Salvador in the 80s, did not have Mara Salvatrucha. That's an LA gang transplanted there, deported. They deported tens of thousands of people, and it wasn't just Mara Salvatrucha, it was all the Chicano gangs, but the majority went to Mexico, which is a whole different country, which we can talk about sometime about why that's different than El Salvador. But El Salvador is a relatively small country, with no resources, some of the poorest people you want to meet, and they drop all these highly sophisticated street gang guys from LA. I don't know if you're aware about this. The Mara Salvatrucha is tied in with all the Chicano gangs, the Sureños, we call it. They're part of the Sureño structure. They, in turn, take orders from the Mexican mafia. The Mexican mafia trained all these soldiers. And then we deported them to countries that didn't have no understanding of what was happening. In El Salvador, they understood politics, they understood poverty, they understood war between those that have and those that have not. They didn't understand drive-bys and kidnappings and killing people and their family members for nothing, for very little nothing. They didn't understand these heavily tattooed guys, these guys choloed out, all dressed, cholo dress. You know what cholo stuff is. If you don't, we can talk about that. They didn't understand these guys that talked a weird Spanish. I understood them because that was my homies. That's the way my neighborhood was. That's what Las Lomas, my gang was. We were the ones that, I hate to say this, that helped set the basis of this in the 60s and 70s. But even then, there was Pachucos from the 30s and 40s, so there was always a seed somewhere below that. And, but I went to El Salvador to work with these gang kids. In '96, after I was there in '91, '3, met with a lot of people, went to several prisons. In '96, I came back and I helped broker the first gang peace between MS-13 and their rivals, 18th Street, which, by the way, 18th Street is probably the biggest gang in the country. Nobody talks about them. Most of them are Mexican. It started in the 60s by Chicano kids. Salvadorans joined them, and they are part of it, but they also deported them. And MS-13 is an enemy of theirs because MS-13 used to be in 18th Street. They had a falling out, and they've been a war ever since. They took that war to El Salvador. It's a war from the streets of LA to a country that don't even know what 18 is, don't even know what any of this stuff is, don't even know what the 13 means. So they go down there and they're going to war and they're killing each other at a high rate. Right now, El Salvador has the highest murder rate in the country. Honduras also has MS-13 and 18th Street, the second highest murder rate in the world. I'm not talking, not the country, the world. And in Guatemala, where I've been in all those countries. I spent a month in Honduras last year working with abandoned kids. So why am I mentioning all these? They're monsters, as I said here, of our making. We created this mess, and then we send it to other people who had no idea what was going on. Now we got these most violent places. And again, that peace that I helped broker in '96 was completely undermined by the Salvadoran government. In 2010, there was a national peace in El Salvador, 2012. I went back, this time with people from New York, from London, from San Francisco, from Washington, D.C., and LA. We went back to help and at least advise and advocate for this peace. I went to 10 prisons there. We got a lot of great information. I met amazing young men, heavily tattooed. Some of them probably did some horrendous things, but now want peace. And we went back to the government to say, we can make it happen. I did a talk the next year at the Organization of American States. I flew in to San Salvador. The countries from all over the Americas was there, and then they stopped me from doing my talk. And I'm gonna tell you this is true. They told me not to talk about the gang peace, that if we did, the US government would pull millions of dollars out of the Organization of American States. The US government, and this is under Obama, by the way. This is a problem Republicans and Democrats have participated in. So I couldn't speak about the gang peace because they would take millions of dollars. I ended up talking about gang intervention, gang prevention, which is all good, it's all valuable. I couldn't say a word about this peace. That gang peace brought violence down 40 to 70% in El Salvador. There was a daily murder rate of like 14 to 20 people dead. With the gang peace, less than 5 a day. You go there now, completely racked with violence. The big industry that the US has supported there is the private security industry. Billions of dollars is used to bring in large guns, hire security people to set up in every store. If you've ever been to El Salvador, Guatemala, and these countries, you know almost every store there's a guy with a big heavy-duty assault gun in front of the store. It's a whole security thing set up. The prisons that used to be very poor, run down, now are looking like maximum security prisons in the United States. This is the industry we've supported and we've allowed with billions of dollars. So I'm convinced somebody with a lot of power doesn't want peace in our streets, doesn't want our kids to be given treatment, resources, or tools, or get education, or get themselves together. There's a lot of power that wants to stop the work that some of you, I'm sure, have done, and if you don't know, many of us have done around the country. I want to say something about Chicago, and again, I want to open it up to you. I've been in Chicago for 15 years, and I want to share a few things with that. But one thing about Chicago, we had a thing called Increase the Peace Network. It was effective, it worked. We worked in 12 communities, black and brown. We stopped gang violence. We had what was called peace zones, which I tried to institute in El Salvador. Peace zones where you had a zone run by one gang, let's say the Latin Kings. And we had an agreement with the Latin Kings that would say, we won't do any drugs or any violence. The leaders had to say that. But we, from our end, had to provide jobs, schooling, treatment for drugs, and a place for kids to hang out. We tried to do that, and we couldn't get the adults to agree. It was the youth that agreed, and the adults, none of them could agree. The Chicago Police Department undermined everything we did. They even attacked our kids as they were going from a church to have meetings. The schools would have zero tolerance, which means they didn't want any gang kids. And then the businesses would back out. The ones that destroyed it were the adults in the community who want so much to stop gangs, but don't want to see it really happen. They love it when you build prisons, because there's money in prisons. They don't love it when you actually try to resolve something. And the end result now, you go to Chicago now, as you know, the most violent gang communities in the country. I mentioned all this, but I want to tell you there is answers and there's ways to go. And I'm going to share with you a couple of things, and then I want to talk with you. One is I myself, and because I'm a poet, I love writing. I'm into writing, so I'm going to tell everything through my writing. I did a children's book called It Doesn't Have to Be This Way, about a young man who's thinking of joining a gang. And the thing about this book is that it's beautifully illustrated. It's in Spanish and English. It's the second most popular book that I have sold. It's used in a lot of schools, but it's also got something that nobody can imagine. A young person is shot here. Now people say, why would you put that in a children's book? Because this book is different. It's meant to go to communities in which this is a regular occurrence, in which people, kids know what's going on, who have walked over dead bodies or close by them, who know what happened. Now this girl doesn't die. She actually ends up in a wheelchair, but she ends up beginning to help change a young man's life. I wanted to tell the story of what the importance of mentoring, guidance, and poetry and art and creativity is in our communities. I wrote that story. Also, as you know, my 2 memoirs have been sold all over the country. These tell the full story, including that of my son. People know that my son Ramiro got into a gang in Chicago. He got very active. He ended up doing 15 years in prison. He's been released now for 8 years. It's very sad when your own kid gets involved in these things. He was very active, but I will say to his benefit, on his own, with a lot of guidance from me, but really on his own, he has now left the gang life. He's been out of prison all these years. He's been helpful. He's gang-free, crime-free, and drug-free. And now he's helping mentoring our young youth group at the Cultural Center that was talked about here. He's helping young people change their lives. So I have to say that I'm very proud of my son, Ramiro, even though I thought there was a time where I didn't think he was going to make it. It just goes to show people can't do it. So this books tell this story. But the other book, 2 things I want to share is one, Hearts and Hands. This is the book that summarizes the 40 years I've done in this work, in this field, in LA, in Chicago, mostly Chicago. Also mentions El Salvador, Guatemala, and a few other places. And this is one of the most important things, effective community-based gang intervention. This is a project that I spent 2 years with, working with 40 other gang interventionists in LA, all black and brown, working together with no money, coming up with a plan that could help solve gang violence in the United States. It was approved by the city of Los Angeles, and there's even House of Representatives bill drawn up, which, by the way, right now it can't be passed because we don't get the people in Washington, D.C. that want to do this. But it's still there. I helped write this bill, and we put together a plan of how to stop gang violence. The city of LA, by the way, was the gang capital of the country. It no longer is. In the 90s, there was more than 1,000 people killed there. And from 1980 to the year 2000, 10,000 young people lost their lives in the streets of Los Angeles. Now it is one of the safest cities relative to most cities in the country. A lot of it was this effort. You understand? I took this to Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, when it was the murder capital of the world in 2010. I took it to El Salvador. I took it to England and even met with the Home Department there who were interested in looking at this. I took it to Argentina because I want people to see there is a way. Now again, this is LA. You can't make this fit in Boston. You can't make this fit in Chicago. Everybody has to create their own, you know what I'm saying? But it has enough thread, universal knowledge and understanding that anybody can apply it. So it's a very good program, and I am willing to send PDFs of this in Spanish and English if anybody's interested. If you give me your card with your email address, I will make a point of sending this to you so you all should have this. This is free. We published several copies, and I've given it out. This is one of the last copies that I have left. I mention all this because there is a lot of literature, and this is just me. There's a lot of people out there with answers, solutions, experiences. And I think that that's what we have to look at. And it can't just be about gangs. It has to be about a whole community approach. The whole community has to be saved. The whole community has to be taken out of its poverty chains. The whole community has to be, police have to stop killing our kids. The mass incarceration system has to change completely. We don't need that kind of situation because it only perpetrates the violence in the streets. What happens when you go to prison and you don't got no resources? What do you become? A very good, well-trained criminal at the expense of our tax dollars. Because they're going to learn something, you understand? And if we don't give them treatment, rehabilitation, we don't give them tools, they're going to learn to be good criminals. This is how the Mexican Mafia became the biggest prison organization in the country and has influenced people from all over, not just in California. People don't know about the Mexican Mafia because nobody's going after them. They're going after the Mara Salvatrucha, which is only one small end of it. You see what I'm saying? Why don't they go after the Mexican Mafia? Because they're too entrenched. They're too much part of the system. You understand? I don't know if you do understand, but anyway, there's a lot of criminality that's part of the system. They love the Mexican Mafia when they do criminal things. They don't love them when they do political, social things. You understand what I'm saying? In the 60s, some of them tried to do that. The leader of the Mexican Mafia met with George Jackson, Rodolfo Cadena. He's actually pretty much worshipped to this day. He met with George Jackson to help change things. As you know, George Jackson was killed in San Quentin, and Rodolfo Cadena was stabbed 57 times in Chino prison. When they killed them off, they killed the possibility of unity around real peace, real change, real change. For example, the Latin Kings, the same thing. The Latin Kings in the 60s were a political-minded group. Read their Bible, if you ever read their own writings. They talk about community. They talk about no drugs. They talk about these things. But guess who was with them at the same time? The Young Lords. You guys remember the Young Lords? Young Lords, same community. Came out of the same neighborhoods, Puerto Rican group out of Chicago. They became politicized. They became part of a major political movement. They got crushed, attacked, jumped out. Not to say there's no great Young Lord still leaders out there, but the Young Lords have pretty much died out. And so what happened is some members of the Latin Kings said, we're not going to do what the Young Lords did. We're going to stay criminal. And guess what? Nobody went after the Latin Kings. You understand what I'm saying? I had a friend in East St. Louis who was a Black Panther. East St. Louis, anybody ever been there? It's one of the worst communities you ever want. The people are great. The most impoverished, most resourceless places you ever want to be at. Some of the worst slums you ever want to see. And I was there talking, almost all African-American, and Miles Davis came out of there. So they got a school for him, and I spoke to Miles Davis Elementary School, spoke to kids. I met with some people there, and there was a guy from the ex-Black Panther who did many years in prison. And he finally, after I said my talk, he said, I'm going to tell you something. I was in the Black Panthers. I was being tracked. My phone was being tapped. I couldn't go anywhere. I gave up the Black Panthers. I joined the local street gang. I started selling drugs. When crack happened, I became a crack dealer. Nobody came after me. Nobody tapped my phone after I became a gangster. I made money. You know, he even had a tear in his eye. You know, he just wanted me to know when he was political and trying to change things, people went after him. When he became a criminal and tried to hurt people, nobody did. I'm not saying they're not going after some people, but it's all surface. You understand what I'm getting at? It is surface. Some of the guys are getting the MS-13, they're going, everybody's talking about them, they're going after them. They're not even getting the heavy-duty guys. They're getting guys who are just peripheral. I know, because I've talked to them. I was there involved with the RICO Act against MS-13 in LA. They got 22, 23 guys. I talked to them all. Almost all of them were peripheral of the gang. But this is a big RICO Act. This is the big gang thing. We're going to get these guys. It's a farce. We're not going to stop gang violence, and we're not going to stop these gangs. And they might change names, but we're not going to stop them until we deal with poverty, until we deal with the very root of what's causing all these things, until we deal with the economic and political prisons that people are put in, until we address the real vital roots of things. Like Henry Thoreau once said, people keep hacking at the branches and nobody's going to the roots. Get to the root. Let's be root doctors in order to save our kids. I know it's possible anywhere. I don't care what country, but I also know what's holding it back. Thank you very much for listening. I appreciate that very much. And I do want to have a dialogue, and we do have a mic. So if anybody feels like saying something or asking questions or challenging me or even making comments, please do so.
I heard you say that poverty is an issue, but don't you think it's really the issue of the breakdown of the family?
I think the breakdown of the family is a very important issue. I also think it's related to poverty. My family was a good family. We came from Mexico because of poverty. We ended up in Watts, which is a great community, only it's very poor. I remember my dad trying to find a job and couldn't find one. He worked in dog food factories, he worked in paint factories, he worked wherever he could. He sold Bibles on the weekend and pots and pans to survive. We were evicted. We had gas turned down. My mother tried to move us away from my dad. She was getting tired. She had 4 kids, and she was going to go back to Mexico. And we were homeless there for a while, just until we could get back. And she got to the train station, the Union Station, and she backed off completely. She couldn't go back to Mexico with 4 kids and starve. You understand what I'm saying? Poverty destroys families. There's actually good families in these poor communities, by the way, and there's actually good people in poor communities. Some of them are amazing. There's good churches. There's people that go to church, amazing people in poverty. So it isn't like that's the whole issue, but you can see how being poor, not having enough, not having a job, being homeless will destroy your family. So I think families are important. I think families are something we should focus on, but you can't just focus just on families without focusing at, again, why they're falling apart. And that to me would be one of the issues, to look at poverty as one of the reasons why these families fall apart. As you know, gang members join gang members, say, because they're looking for family. Their own families are not there. So a gang becomes a new family. Again, this is the way poverty, begins to undermine the family structure. So I don't know if that helps, but I mean, just to give, it's all important, but I also know that if we didn't have this level of poverty, and you're talking about the richest country in the world. I get the poverty in El Salvador and Guatemala and Mexico and all over the place. This is the richest country in the world. I'll tell you one other thing. LA is one of the richest cities in the world. One of the richest. There's 58 billionaires in LA. It has also got the largest homeless street population in the country, 58,000 in the streets. That to me is what destroys families. I don't know if I hope I'm making sense. We do everything we can to save families, but we also know what keeps generating the destruction of families in those inner cities and these communities.
My question is about schools. So in your experience, I know you visited a lot of schools. What have you seen that schools do that's both helpful and hurtful for young people that go to their school who are either gang affiliated or at risk for being recruited into a gang? So like both sides of the spectrum, what they're doing right and what they're
So I'll give you an example of some bad examples of, there's a school in Pilsen, which is the large Mexican community in Chicago. It was called Benito Juarez, which is a hero in Mexico. Benito Juarez High School had 18 gangs. I came in there and did some work, after school work with kids. We changed kids' lives. We helped change them. My book was used everywhere. Somehow in the middle of everything, a new principal came in. The word down was zero tolerance. So now they threw me out, took out my books from the school. Kids were treated like dirt. They had like 1,000 kids the first freshman year. Only 200 to 300 graduated when they finished that up to senior year because they got rid of everybody else. Zero tolerance meant you almost had to get rid of the whole school. You know what I'm saying? They didn't tolerate anything. And there was graffiti on the walls, so by the time that zero tolerance came in, the walls were clean, the libraries were not that, we had a few books, but there was hardly any kids. You understand what I'm getting at? So I went to another school recently, and this is actually 2 schools I want to mention. I was in East Harlem just last month. There's a really beautiful school called Judith K. High School, of the kids that nobody wants. You know, if they don't make it in this school, they're in the street. I spoke to them. Mostly African-American, Dominican, some Mexican, black and brown kids. man, they were so interested in my book because it was the only book that they could relate to. A book that tells their story. They didn't have any other books like that in these zero-tolerance schools, you know what I'm saying? Nobody wants to read in those books, in those schools, because there's no books they can relate to. Here, they use my book. They also teach them skills. They also give them drug treatment. They also have girls that are pregnant, have babies. They help them make sure they got health care. This is a school in East Harlem. I recently, in fact, 2 weeks ago, went to a school in Watts. The school was built right after the Watts uprising of the Watts Rebellion in 1965. 2 years later, they built the school. They built it around, on top of a row of houses that they tore down. One of them was a house I lived in on 111th Street. And I remember speaking to these kids. I said, we could be speaking from my living room right now, because, this is where I used to live, right here with the schools on there. They had a thing called Jet Space. I think it was a joint educational team space to provide parents, teachers, and the students an opportunity to work together. The difference I saw is those kids, again, troubled kids, no industry. Watts was surrounded by industry. There was a big GM plant. There was the steel mill that I worked in. There was all kinds, it's all gone. There's malls now, strip malls for the big GM plant. There's warehouses, but no big industry. It's all gone. Anyway, and several housing projects are still there, and like, Bloods and Crips, and also all the Sureño gangs are all there. These kids were given a voice. That's what made the difference. They could be heard. Adults could sit there and listen to them. If they were in a gang, instead of throwing them out, they helped them. You see what I'm saying? Because they're going to be in a gang, but if nobody wants anything to do with them, they're in the streets with no guidance, no support, no mentoring. At least in the school, they say, you're in a gang, you're on drugs, fine. Stay in school, we'll give you what you need. At least adults could be there and watch you when you want to get suicidal. There was a girl there that was suicidal, and we had to talk to her, actually, and she's being helped right now. There was a number of these things that helps to have adults see and watch and be there for these people, for these young people, But when you have zero tolerance, when you have schools that don't provide books that they care about, when you don't want to talk about gangs and you don't want to talk about sex even, these kids take it to the street. They're going to learn it somewhere. You understand what I'm saying? Like, for example, this book has a lot of graphic scenes, and it was banned all over the country. And I had an editorial in the San Jose Mercury about this book because somebody was saying, my book encourages kids to have sex. Tell people, no book does that. It's called hormones. But, they don't want to be real. They think, a book is going to do that? Are you kidding me? They're hormones, but what they need is guidance on it. I had no guidance. I had terrible, terrible, terrible sex life, which is portrayed in the book. It was terrible. It was a mess. I made every mistake a young person can make, including impregnating somebody that shouldn't have been impregnated, not knowing nothing, no support. You know what I'm saying? I want people to know that we can teach young people how to live as human beings if you give them that knowledge, if they got mentoring, if they got the guidance, if any one of you mentored somebody, you would help young people find their way. And that's what I'm calling for, community to step up where even families can't do it. But if their families are strong, supporting those families.
What role do you think churches as kind of a center of community could play? What role do you think role models of faith could play in the lives of these kids? I just asked because my parents were youth ministers in New York in the 80s and 90s, and they had the most kids coming to them because they didn't have zero tolerance. They said, come to us. We're not going to censor everything. We're not going to turn you away because of the life you've led. Do you believe that having a sort of foundation in faith could also help in kind of just looking for guidance and somewhere for them to turn?
Yes, I do. I absolutely do. People think that this is not important. I think young people being spiritually engaged is part of the problem. They're not being spiritually engaged. And I think that if you were to go, okay, here's what I have to say about Christians or any religion, because all of them are valid in my view. You know what I'm saying? People want to say this one religion is better than the other. Well, that might be your belief, but that's no way, but people do this. Everyone is valid, but here's what they all want to do. Every religion group. They want to make you a better Christian? No. They're trying to make you a better Muslim? No. They're trying to make you a better Buddhist? No. They're trying to make you a better, more decent human being. That's what Christianity is. You think Jesus Christ said, hey, I want you to be a good Christian. He never said that. He said, love God above all else. Love your neighbor as yourself. Treat people decently. Blessed are the poor. He said all these great things. Take care of each other. Love each other. Be decent to each other. Respect each other. See what I'm saying? That's what every religion is, and kids need this. They need spiritual engagements, and I really honor those churches that have opened the doors and said, we don't care what we've done, you still belong in our community. You know what I'm saying? Because other people have closed those doors. And by the way, unfortunately, some churches have too. But we do have churches I work with that open those doors. I work with Father Greg Boyle. He's got the best program for gang anywhere, Homeboy Industries in LA. I've been there, I've mentored their youth, I worked with him. I worked with evangelical churches. I worked with Muslim among the youth. I myself, my spiritual practice is Native American. That's who I am. I am a Native American, by the way, and I don't mind going back to that. But I work with everybody. My spiritual practice doesn't mean I can't listen to the teachings of Jesus or even the teachings of Muhammad. I can learn from everybody. But I do have my spiritual practice because my mother's Tarahumara Native, and I'm going to go back to my roots. That's the only reason. Doesn't mean I don't abide or listen to. I don't think I'm better than anybody. I want to proselytize and convert nobody. You know what I mean? But does that mean me following the red road? Does that mean so I can be a better Indian? No. Again, to be a better human being, a more decent, respectful human being who can walk in this world with some dignity and don't take nobody else's dignity away. So to me, churches like that are very, very important. Yeah.
I first met you in December of 1994 in your kitchen in Chicago with your wife and Ramiro there. And eventually got you to come and speak in schools in Boston.
Yeah. I know you. I remember you. We've all gotten older since then. I had black hair at the time.
Worcester and
Exactly.
Springfield.
I do know you.
And I can say one of the young woman was asking about things that worked and things that didn't work. We had kids, if you recall, that said, I've been in this school for 4 years, and this is the only book I've ever read cover to cover. There are kids that, yes, there's sex, and there was a big thing about teachers with the book being banned. I mean, that was an anathema to them at that time. But you also go on to say, to show how being in the gang life, love, relationships, it lost meaning. So it goes full circle from, you might have had these, what you thought at the time were thrills, but it also has about moments in there that kids remember when instead of being a bystander, that you stood up because you just couldn't go along with some things that were happening, but you wrote about how it was a struggle. Yeah. So one of the things that did not work was the fact that a lot of schools, even though it was provocative material that the kids wanted to read, they themselves banned these books, or there was an administrator, or after Louis came and spoke, you know, it was a nice show, and then it moved on. Yeah. But the thing that worked, and the question I want to get to, at that time we were using some poetry from the Concrete River. Yeah. And, you know, you mentioned it. You talked about kids finding their voice. And because Louis Rodriguez was there talking about writing poetry, and that story of you being in the library and reading books and your dad was cleaning up and everything, and it was okay for them. They just needed a model of someone to say it was okay, and the teachers started getting them to write poetry, and they were finding their voice because they were telling their story. So thank you for indulging me, but my question is, so in that curriculum, are you, or is there something online that will give some teachers some guidance about how to incorporate using poetry in classrooms as a way of helping students find their voice? Thank you.
So thank you so much. I was facing history, right? I remember. If anybody's interested, I do have a curriculum for hearts and hands. But of course, you should get the book, but also it's a curriculum that really expresses all that. In here, I talk about how I introduce poetry into the classroom and the prisons differently than other people do. I don't just have prompts. I have these psychoactive things. Like, for example, I put them in a forest where they talk about the whole forest, but in the middle is a road. What is it all about? They don't know that it means where they think they're going. Most of the time, they get stuck in that forest. I put them on a train. And I say, you're on a train, you got 3 stops, 3 markers in your life. And at each stop, you're gonna drop off baggage and pick up baggage. What are you dropping off? What are you picking up? They say when you first went to school, when you first had a baby, when you first went to prison, or whatever it might be. You know, what did you leave, what did you pick up? I give them all these kind of, I guess they're prompts, but they're different. They're psychoactive. They get them to think, they get them to feel. And they're metaphors for how to live and how to not only be creative writers, but creative thinkers and creative livers, that they live creatively to go through the world. So I appreciate the work that was done. I'm still in touch with Faces History in LA. I'm going to do something with them, I think, in June. So very important work. But again, like all these great groups that are out there, it's not supported thoroughly. We got great people doing amazing things in all our communities. And they're almost like the shouts and shadows in the distance, you know, because the big stuff, the real important stuff isn't being done. Thank you very much. Thank you.
It's obviously, you know, it's very personal, but I was wondering if you would mind sharing something personal with yourself. Maybe that moment, that final straw that said, hey, I want to be accountable to my community and I want to be a champion for peace. Can you share that moment with us?
That's a very good question. I have several, but I think what I'm going to do is, and maybe just mention one. When I was given this Poet Laureate in LA, and I'm already no longer Poet Laureate, I did it for 2 years. They did it in the downtown library, LA. The mayor, great guy, gave me this big plaque, Poet Laureate for the whole city. He didn't know that when I was 15 years old, I was homeless in the streets of LA, downtown. I was shooting up heroin. I had a .22 handgun that I used to protect myself, but also to mug people in Chinatown and Rivera Street, which is the Pueblo, the first neighborhood, where all the tourists hang out. He didn't know that my refuge was that library. He didn't know that I would show up every day to read books and books and books. Books saved my life. I read every book I could. I love Charlotte Soria, but I probably read it 20 times. I read Ray Bradbury, who I found out years later actually wrote some of his books there in that library. I read Malcolm X, changed my life. You know, how does somebody live in Harlem on drugs, gangs, and everything, goes to prison, and books change his life? That's what I learned by reading these books. So books were important, and that's why I feel bad when people want to ban books. When you need more books out there telling stories, get out there being real, and people want to ban books. It's the most craziest thing we have in this country, you know? But I think that's one story I would leave. There's so many, but that's one that helped me see there's imagination gets engaged, then everything else follows. For Native peoples, the imagination is feminine energy. You need masculine energy to make it happen, but the feminine has to lead. You understand? We don't get that. We have a patriarchy in which the masculine leads. Business, right? The bottom line, take care of business, be practical. That's what we have. Well, in Native peoples, the feminine leads and the masculine follows. You can't have implementation without imagination. Thank you.
Do we have time for one more question?
Yes, absolutely.
All right, great.
Yeah, it sounds like you've read a lot of the stuff that you talked about, 13th, things
Yeah.
like that. And you also mentioned every city is different, requiring different implementation. Yeah. So my question is, it was about Boston. I don't know if you've observed much. Right now, the city's getting very expensive to live in. We have a huge gentrification thing. You know, everyone talks about the opioid thing, but no one talks about the price jacking thing. Yeah. And I think you mentioned poverty. That's obviously a major contributor. My question to you is there a way to curb that or reverse that in any sort of way?
So there's three things. One, I've been in Boston. I've been to many schools here. I did, on other occasions, met with gang kids. I was in touch with some Latin kids out of the Massachusetts state prison system that were trying to change their lives. And I also saw all those changes, as you're pointing out. On a personal note, my second wife was from Roxbury. And so, you know, I know about some of that, the community. But I also know that gentrification is changing every community. The suburbs have become the new ghettos. You know what I'm saying? And poor people are just being thrown out and about. They're being pushed over. And LA is taking the form of sending them to the deserts. The deserts used to be where retirees that were at, now it's just poor people, terrible housing being sent out there. LA, since the uprising in 1992, has lost 20% of its African-American population because of gentrification. It's lost a lot of Latinos too, but that's really hurts a lot in the African-American community. So the point is that we're being pushed out, and people with money are moving in, and we can't afford these rents. We can't afford to be in those communities. We're losing out our own community. Finally, when people had some jobs, they had their lives together, they had their own businesses, the things looked good, they come in and pull the economic rug from under us. So I think this is a big problem in every city. I do see it in Boston. I was in Boston 2-3 years ago. I was in the middle of a blizzard, unfortunately, but I was here. And I started seeing all these changes where you cannot survive in this city anymore, and everybody gets pushed out. What's the answer? Again, here's the sad thing. You have to have a paradigm shift at the very root level. That means you can't make capitalism a sacred thing anymore. They make like a sacred thing. Marketplace is sacred. Nonsense. We have got to examine everything. The reason why we're in crisis is that everything's in crisis, including churches, including politics. Democrats and Republicans are all in crisis. There is nobody that's not in crisis because the crisis is deep. You know what I'm saying? And then that means that it's an opportunity. What is crisis? Something has to die, something has to be reborn. We have to be clear about what has to go away and what has to be allowed to be born. People think when they're in personal crisis, they think they have to die. This is why suicides happen. Just part of them has to die, you know what I'm saying? But there's another part being reborn. That's one thing I like about Christianity. They talk about being reborn, but my thing is you got to be reborn many times in your life, you know? Constantly. When you're in crisis, it means you're out of alignment. So we're out of alignment in this country, and we're up here distracted by this crazy presidency. People, I mean, you know, we're being distracted with weird things, and we're not dealing with the fundamental things. You know what I'm getting at? And so here we are doing everything else, including possibly going to war again, over again with somebody else. And the point is, we're not looking at what's going on in our communities and with our families. And that's where I think that distractions all work. There's a reason why this guy's president. Because it's the politics of chaos that is keeping us off our feet. It's a planned thing. They didn't plan Trump, but they did plan chaos as a way to keep us off our feet so that we can't think straight, so that we can't unite, so that we're out there fighting everybody but the real problem. You see what I'm getting at? White people are fighting black people. Black people are fighting everybody else. We're fighting everybody. Mexicans don't even know where they fit in. You see what I'm saying? We're just fighting everybody. We're just confused. How many people hate Mexicans in this country? It's gotten worse over the years. It's like, why in the world would they do that? But that's where we're at. So the point is we're hating each other. We're fighting each other. Democrats hate Republicans. Republicans hate Democrats. Everybody's at war. And guess what? We're all thrown off. We're off kilter. There is no centering. You understand what I'm saying? The politics of chaos guarantees no center. And yet we still have to find the center in ourselves and in our communities and to take it out. And I think that's the only good thing. The periphery is now where the heartbeat of America is. It's not at the center of the country. The center is hollow and chaotic. The periphery is where the heart is beating and where the blood is coming back to give us life. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it all. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.